Welcome to This Week in JACC, your fast and focused briefing on what's new and what matters in cardiovascular science, straight from the pages of JACC. I'm Harlan Krumholz, Editor-in-Chief of JACC, and in this issue, we explore the evolving role of clinicians in device safety, new evidence on the total event burden with abbreviated DAPT treatment, drug-coated balloon strategies for complex restenosis, and a first-in-human study of a surgical polymer mitral valve. We also cover expert guidance on obesity care, the fellowship application process in the U.S., and lessons from across JACC journals. So let's get started. The editor's page this week is the role of clinicians in advancing cardiovascular device safety, and I write it with Kushal Kadakia and Sanket Dhruva. We take on a broad and important topic, clinician responsibility in ensuring the safety of cardiovascular devices. Despite the central role that devices play in cardiovascular care, more than a third of cardiologists report limited understanding of how these devices are actually regulated by the FDA. And that's concerning, especially given that cardiovascular devices account for more high-risk recalls than any other area. This piece aims to clear up some key misconceptions. One of the biggest, what the term recall actually means. We often assume a recall implies pulling a product from the market, but in nearly half of the most severe Class 1 cardiovascular device recalls, the device remains in use. The instructions may simply be to evaluate and educate patients with no product withdrawal. That disconnect between public perception and regulatory action matters. And here's another key thing. Although most devices now include a unique device identifier, a kind of barcode that tracks manufacturing details, these codes are rarely scanned into the electronic health record or claims systems. Instead, the FDA relies on a passive surveillance through tools like the MAUDE database, which suffers from underreporting, delays, and inconsistent quality. This is an antiquated system that needs to be reformed. Nevertheless, sometimes these reports in MAUDE can drive regulatory actions, but the feeling is that maybe there are other things we should be doing that we just don't know about. As clinicians, we must learn how to report adverse events effectively, push for real integration of device tracking into our health systems, and engage with professional societies to develop rapid shared guidance when safety concerns arise. Device innovation is moving fast, but safety can't be an afterthought. We write, we must demand transparency, support surveillance, and guide responsible innovation. Now to the original research. Master DAPT, recurrent events in the case for abbreviated therapy. This week in JACC, we revisit the Master DAPT trial, but with a deeper lens on total clinical events. You might recall the original findings published in NEJM in 2021. Among patients at high bleeding risk who underwent PCI with a biodegradable polymer sirolimus-eluting stent, 1 month of DAPT was non-inferior to continued therapy for net adverse clinical events and for MACE, M-A-C-C-E, and superior for reducing clinical or clinically relevant non-major bleeding. This JACC paper by Bongiovanni and colleagues extends that work. Their key innovation, a recurrent events analysis, not just looking at time to first events. Instead of just measuring whether a patient had one event, they count all the events, including multiple bleeds or ischemic episodes per patient. That's a big deal because in clinical practice, every event matters. And why not take advantage of all the information about the events and not just the time to a first event? So what did they find? Bleeding events, especially recurrent ones, were substantially lower in the abbreviated DAPT group. This strengthens the argument that shorter DAPT isn't just safer on average, but safer over the course of a patient's entire journey. On the ischemic side, total MACE was similar between groups, but importantly, 20% of these MACE events occurred after a bleeding event. That suggests that patients who bleed may be at higher ischemic risk later, a potential signal of vulnerability, therapy interruption, or both. The temporal relationship could have real clinical implications. Here's how the authors put it. Our findings reaffirm the safety and efficacy of abbreviated DAPT, but add new insights, particularly highlighting the relevance of recurrent bleeding events. And 1 MACE in every 5 occurred after a bleeding event, whereas 1 bleeding event every 25 occurred after a MACE. These observations point to a sobering truth. Bleeding may beget ischemia, making the case for a bleeding avoidance strategy up front. Dr. Babar's accompanying editorial sums it up perfectly. Quote, these findings support the evolving concept that after a complete minimum duration of DAPT, clinical decisions should be predicated on bleeding risk. So the takeaway, when you account for all events, not just the first, abbreviated DAPT continues to show a strong safety profile, particularly for high bleeding risk patients. And bleeding may not just be a nuisance. It could be a harbinger of a worse outcome to come. Next, original research, fighting back against multi-layer in-stent restenosis, insights from Agent IDE. So this is for those who are interventionalists. You know the feeling. You're in the cath lab and you see a lesion wrapped in 2, maybe 3 layers of metal. Limited space, limited options, and a high chance that whatever you do won't last. This week in JACC, we get new data that could shift the treatment landscape for this difficult group of patients. The authors use the phrase multi-layer in-stent restenosis. It's worth noting that this terminology is not exactly standard in the medical literature. The more precise description is in-stent restenosis involving multiple layers of stent, meaning restenosis that occurs in a region that's already treated with 2 or more stents. This is a particularly high-risk phenotype, and many existing guidelines provide limited direction for its management. So let's recall the Agent IDE trial. This was a prospective multi-center randomized controlled trial conducted at 40 U.S. centers between May 2021 and August 2022. A total of 600 patients with coronary in-stent restenosis were enrolled. Nearly half, 258 or 43%, had this in-stent restenosis involving multiple stent layers. Most had 2 layers of stent, while a smaller number had 3. Participants were randomized in a 2-to-1 ratio. 405 patients received a paclitaxel-coated balloon. 194 patients received an uncoated balloon angioplasty. Randomization was stratified by stent layering, single versus multiple, allowing for pre-specified subgroup analysis, such as this. What are the key findings? Patients with multiple stent layers had a higher 1-year target lesion failure rate than those with a single layer in-stent restenosis. In this high-risk group, the paclitaxel balloon reduced the target lesion failure from 40% to 24%, hazard ratio of 0.55. This benefit was driven by significant reductions in target lesion revascularization, target vessel myocardial infarction, and it's important to note that all 6 stent thromboses in the trial occurred in the uncoated balloon group, exclusively among patients with multiple stent layers. Absolute event rates were still pretty modest in this trial, especially considering the high-risk nature of the population. Nonetheless, the relative differences were clinically and statistically significant. In their accompanying editorial, Oliva, Guido, and Mehran emphasized the need for lifetime management approach to in-stent restenosis. They acknowledge while DES implantation may offer better acute options, adding additional stent layers raises the risk of future ISR and limits future options. They write, quote, they also highlight the broader significance of the study. Agent IDE was the first U.S.-based randomized trial to support FDA approval of a coronary paclitaxel-coated balloon. And this sub-study helps expand the evidence for managing some of the most complex in-stent restenosis cases that are faced in practice. Next study, a new contender in mitral valve replacement, 1-year outcomes from a trial of a surgical polymer valve by George et al. In the world of mitral valve replacement, the conversation is long centered on 2 options, mechanical valves, which offer durability at the cost of lifelong anticoagulation, and bioprosthetic valves, which offer lifestyle flexibility but at the price of structural deterioration, especially in younger patients who will have a long time horizon with the valve. This week, JACC shows a study by George and colleagues that introduced a potential third option, a surgically implanted polymer valve, and reports 1-year results from a multi-center trial in India. So why polymer? Polymer leaflet valves represent an engineering-driven approach to prosthetic design. The valve studied here uses life polymer, a special material with a strong track record recorded in biomedical applications like pacing lead insulation and coronary stent coverings. What makes it appealing? Well, biostability and resistance to degradation, mechanical strength, calcification resistance. In short, these valves are designed to resist the very processes, calcification, enzymatic degradation, and mechanical failure that shorten the life of traditional bioprostheses. They also hold the potential to provide durable performance without requiring lifelong anticoagulation, unlike the mechanical valves. So this was a prospective first-in-human trial that enrolled only 67 patients across 8 sites in India with implementation of the TRIA surgical mitral valve. At 1 year, all-cause mortality, 9.1%. although no deaths were deemed valve-related. There were 3 ischemic strokes, that's 5%, 2 valve thromboses, that's 4%, and 1 major bleeding event, almost 2%. No structural valve deterioration was observed. Cardiac CT showed no evidence of calcification or thrombus. The patients improved in functional status and quality of life. Look, this was a relatively young cohort. The high event rates actually really shocked me, though when you benchmark it against other studies, it's not off the mark. But I think this shows really the difficulty of rheumatic heart disease in these patients who are pregnant and the issues around surgery. Again, 1 year all-cause mortality in this young cohort, 9%. Now, of course, there's ethical considerations in these trials. As with any first-in-human device, polymer valves have no long-term human durability data, so equipoise, genuine scientific uncertainty must exist. Rigorous safety monitoring was embedded into the study, including the use of standardized criteria for valve performance and complications. There was an attempt to make sure that this trial was transparent, that there was oversight, and patient safety. But you can see that it's hard to enroll in these trials. We engaged 2 editorialists because we thought it was so important, one who focused on the decision-making and one who focused on surgical innovation. The emergence of polymer valves, asking whether the field is ready for a 3-party system, tissue, mechanical, and now polymer valves. They emphasize the potential but underscore the need for long-term data before widespread adoption. In the second editorial, the editorialists take a look at surgical innovation, questioning why the surgical community has lagged in transformative innovation compared with transcatheter technologies. They frame the polymer valve as a symbol of what could be possible, but a reminder of how far there is to go. So this first-generation surgical polymer valve has now passed a critical milestone, successful 1-year clinical performance in a special population. While long-term durability remains unproven, the device's lack of calcification, stable hemodynamics, and good safety profile, I say this guardedly because the outcomes were high, but again, it was okay compared with benchmark data, suggest a real potential, especially for younger patients with rheumatic disease and others poorly served by existing options. Future may yet hold a 3-party system in valve replacement. Next, we had a brief feature, Signaling 101 and Fellowship Match in Cardiovascular Medicine. This is really about what's going on in the U.S., and these authors tackle what's emerging as an important topic for us here. For listeners outside the U.S., here's a brief explanation. Each year, thousands of internal medicine residents apply for subspecialty fellowships through the National Residency Match Program. This process has become increasingly complex and opaque, with many applicants submitting 50 or more applications and programs being overwhelmed with volume. In response, the NRMP and several specialties have adopted preference signaling, a system where applicants can send a limited number of signals to indicate strong interest in the program. The intent is to create a more efficient, transparent process, helping programs identify serious applicants and helping applicants get noticed by the programs that they truly value. From one perspective, signaling empowers applicants to express genuine interest, offering a rare opportunity for intentionality in a system increasingly dominated by volume. It may also improve visibility for candidates from underrepresented backgrounds or smaller training programs. Yet from another angle, signaling adds yet another layer of strategy, stress, and gamesmanship to a process already full of uncertainty. So while it may represent a step towards transparency, we still may have further reforms to go. Next, JACC This Week carried a concise clinical guidance, ACC expert consensus on medical weight management for cardiovascular health. Let me be clear from my perspective. I don't think obesity is a cosmetic issue. It's a chronic relapsing disease, one with profound cardiometabolic consequences. And I think it's squarely in the breadbox of cardiologists. In this issue, these authors present a concise but powerful guidance document offering a comprehensive framework for cardiovascular clinicians to integrate obesity treatment into routine practice. Some of the key themes: obesity is multimodal, lifestyle interventions remain foundational, but today's treatment landscape includes this new generation of anti-obesity medications, which have demonstrated benefits that extend well beyond weight loss. These therapies lower cardiovascular risk in people with established ASCVD and even improve outcomes. The piece also talks about how care must be coordinated, how patient-centered care is essential, including shared decision-making, first-person language, and deliberate design of clinical spaces to reduce stigma. And then safety and evidence matters. The authors call attention to the risks associated with non-evidence-based treatments, like compounded peptides and unregulated supplements. I think the cardiovascular community has a responsibility to treat obesity as a true disease, much like we treat hypertension. And it's important to say this isn't about a character flaw. This, in fact, what we're discovering is something that can be treatable with drugs and is going to transform our approach to how we treat cardiometabolic risk. It's a time for us to fully embrace this work. Also in this issue, there are a few other things. So before we wrap, here's some highlights. We feature a new Amara-Yad anatomic image, part of our ongoing effort to merge visual art with anatomic clarity in cardiovascular education. A thoughtful letter to the editor that expands on recent findings about blood pressure management in older adults. In response to calls for broader outcomes, the authors analyzed over 1,200 deaths in their cohort, and they found that while systolic blood pressure less than 130 was associated with reduced cardiovascular mortality, it was not associated with lower non-CVD mortality, and a U-shaped relationship emerged for all-cause mortality. The lowest risk was observed for systolic blood pressure between 114 and 128 millimeters of mercury. Importantly, frailty modified the effect. Intensive systolic blood pressure control reduced CVD mortality in non-frail individuals, but not those who were frail. This will deserve a lot more attention in future research. The findings do reinforce individualized blood pressure targets. Also in this issue, we reprint some highlights from the other JACC journals. From JACC Basic to Translational Science, we do a recent review that advances our understanding of the basic science behind venous thromboembolism. The authors call for a shift in focus toward venous thrombus remodeling, noting that current anticoagulants fall short in addressing chronic thrombus. From JACC Cardiovascular Interventions, an interdisciplinary expert consensus offers a global algorithm for femoropopliteal lesion treatment, proposing stepwise lesion assessment and device selection strategies to standardize care and improve outcomes in peripheral artery disease. JACC Case Reports, a striking case titled Valvular Heart Disease in Pregnancy-Associated Death, underscores cardiovascular roots of maternal mortality. The authors argue forcefully for cardiology involvement in maternal mortality review committees, particularly when structural heart disease is involved. So what did we learn in this issue? Device safety is a clinician's responsibility. From the editor's page to the discussion of cardiovascular device recalls, we're reminded that clinicians must not only use devices, but also advocate for systems that track, evaluate, and improve them. Second, abbreviated DAPT works, even when you count everything. Master DAPT recurrent events analysis reinforces that shorter DAPT is not only safe, but reduces cumulative bleeding without increasing ischemic risk. 3. Drug-coated balloons have a critical role in complex in-stent restenosis. In the agent IDE substudy, PCB angioplasty was effective in patients with multiple prior stent layers, offering a metal-free strategy with meaningful event reduction. 4. Polymer valves may offer a third option. The trisurgical mitral valve performed well at 1 year, well enough that future studies should be conducted. It also shows us the high risk of these patients. 5. We talked about fellowship signaling and noted that it needs continued efforts to make sure that it's clear and fair. And finally, obesity is a cardiology issue, period. The ACC Concise Clinical Guidance affirms that effective evidence-based tools now exist, and it's up to us to ensure access, reduce stigma, and help our patients achieve cardiometabolic health. I hope you've enjoyed this issue. That's it for JACC This Week. Until next time, stay curious.